There's an old saying that you should respect nature, but I didn't truly understand what that meant until I found myself face to face with it. My hike had been going smoothly, until it wasn't. The first sign of danger came as a rumble, in the distance, faint but growing louder. Then the ground itself seemed to tremble as a massive shape emerged from the trees. The bear's growl shook me to my core, and within seconds, I was fighting for my life. With every swipe, every powerful strike, I realized that I was no longer in control of my fate. The wilderness had taken over and I was at its mercy. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we dive into today's stories, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to stay updated with future stories. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into the first attack. Ethan Morgan eased himself out of bed, his joints creaking in protest. At 62, retirement wasn't quite the restful experience he'd imagined. The cabin always needed work, and today's task was cutting firewood for the approaching winter. He dressed quickly in worn jeans, a thick flannel shirt, and his trusty work boots. As he made his way to the kitchen, Ethan glanced out the window. The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the Montana landscape, painting the trees in vibrant shades of red and gold. It was a view that never failed to take his breath away, even after all these years. He poured himself a cup of strong, black coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs, invigorating him for the day ahead. Ethan took a moment to savor the quiet, broken only by the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Another beautiful day in paradise, he murmured to himself, a small smile playing on his weathered face. Finishing his coffee, Ethan set the mug down and retrieved his axe from its place by the door. The worn wooden handle fit comfortably in his calloused hands, a familiar weight that spoke of years of use. He gave it a few practice swings, his muscles remembering the motion despite the months since he'd last used it. As Ethan made his way down the steps and across the clearing to the woodpile, fallen leaves crunched beneath his boots. The sound brought back memories of countless autumn days spent in these woods, first as a young ranger and later as a seasoned veteran of the Forest Service. Reaching the woodpile, Ethan surveyed the task ahead. A sizable stack of logs awaited his attention, needing to be split into more manageable pieces for the fireplace. He rolled up his sleeves and positioned the first log on the chopping block. "All right, old man," he said to himself. "Let's see if you've still got it." Ethan raised the axe high and brought it down with a satisfying thud. The log split cleanly, in two, and he allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction. He might be retired, but he hadn't lost his touch. As he worked, Ethan fell into a steady rhythm. The repetitive motion was almost meditative, allowing his mind to wander as his body went through the familiar motions. He thought about his life, the path that had led him to this quiet existence in the Montana wilderness. Thud, split, stack, thud, split, stack. The pile of split wood grew steadily larger as the morning wore on. Ethan paused occasionally to wipe the sweat from his brow or take a swig of water from the canteen he'd brought with him. The forest around him seemed to pulse with life, the sounds of birds and small animals going about their day a constant backdrop to his work. As he reached for another log, a memory surfaced of his early days as a ranger. He'd been so green then, eager to prove himself and make a difference. Ethan chuckled softly, remembering the naive enthusiasm of his younger self. "If only you could see me now, kid," he mused aloud. "Still out here, still loving every minute of it." The rhythmic thud of his axe echoed through the forest, shattering the morning silence. It was a sound Ethan had always associated with honest work and the simple pleasure of providing for oneself. In a world that seemed to grow more complicated, by the day, there was something deeply satisfying about this basic task. As he worked, Ethan's thoughts drifted to his neighbors, the Johnsons, who lived a few miles down the road. He made a mental note to check in on them soon, maybe bring over some of the firewood he was cutting. At their age, chopping wood was getting to be too much for them. "Guess I'm not exactly a spring chicken myself anymore," Ethan muttered, feeling a twinge in his lower back as he bent to pick up another log. He straightened up, stretching for a moment before resuming his work. The pile of split wood had grown impressively large, and Ethan felt a sense of pride in his morning's accomplishment. He figured a few more logs would do it for the day, as he positioned another log on the chopping block. A twig snapped in the distance. The sound was sharp and distinct, cutting through the background noise of the forest. Ethan paused, his axe raised mid-swing, his senses suddenly on high alert. Years of experience as a forest ranger had honed his instincts. He knew the usual sounds of the woods, the way animals moved through the underbrush. This sound was different, heavier, more purposeful. Ethan slowly lowered the axe, his eyes scanning the tree line. The forest seemed to have gone unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. He strained his ears, listening for any further disturbance. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Anyone there?" No response came, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, a primal reaction to an unseen threat. He took a few steps away from the woodpile, moving into a more open area where he'd have a better view of his surroundings. His eyes darted from tree to tree, searching for any sign of movement. The shadows between the trunks seemed deeper somehow, full of potential hiding places. Ethan's hand tightened on the axe handle, the tool now feeling more like a weapon than a simple implement for chopping wood. "You're being paranoid, old man," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. Probably just a deer passing through. But even as he said it, Ethan knew it wasn't true. Deer didn't move like that, didn't create that feeling of being watched by something large and potentially dangerous. His mind raced through the possibilities. A bear maybe, or a mountain lion. Both were known to inhabit these woods, though. Encounters were rare. For a long moment, Ethan stood perfectly still, barely breathing as he listened and watched. The forest remained silent, offering no further clues as to what had disturbed the peace of the morning. Slowly, the normal sounds of the woods began to return. A bird called in the distance, then another. The rustling of leaves in the breeze resumed. Whatever had been out there seemed to have moved on. Ethan let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension start to drain from his body. He shook his head, chuckling softly at his own jumpiness. "Getting soft in your old age, Ethan," he scolded himself. "Time was you wouldn't have batted an eye at a little noise in the woods." Still, as he turned back to the woodpile to finish his task, Ethan couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off. His eyes kept darting to the tree line, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. "Just finish up and get back to the cabin," he told himself firmly. "A hot shower and some lunch will set you right." With renewed determination, Ethan raised his axe once more. The familiar motion helped to calm his nerves, and soon he was back in the rhythm of his work. But even as the pile of split wood grew, a small part of his mind remained alert, attuned to the forest around him. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Ethan finally set down his axe, surveying his morning's work with satisfaction. The woodpile was well stocked now, enough to see him through the first cold snaps of winter. He gathered an armful of split logs, intending to carry them back to the cabin's porch. As he turned toward home, Ethan cast one last glance at the tree line. The forest looked as it always had, peaceful and indifferent to his presence. "Imagination playing tricks on you," he muttered, shaking his head. But deep down, as Ethan made his way back to the safety of his cabin, he couldn't quite convince himself that it had all been in his mind. Something had been out there watching him. And somehow he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, it wasn't finished with him yet. Ethan's arms ached pleasantly from the morning's work as he stacked the last of the split logs on his porch. He straightened up, stretching his back and taking in the midday sun filtering through the canopy of autumn leaves. The strange unease from earlier had faded, replaced by the satisfaction of a job well done. "Time for some lunch," he murmured to himself, his stomach growling in agreement. As he reached for the door handle, a low, rumbling growl froze him in place. The sound seemed to vibrate through the air, primal and unmistakable. Ethan's heart began to race, his body tensing as adrenaline flooded his system. Slowly, carefully, he turned around. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a massive grizzly bear. It was up on its hind legs, easily towering over Ethan's 6-foot frame. The bear's fur was a rich brown, tinged with silver, and its small eyes glinted with intelligence and wild power. Time seemed to slow down as Ethan's ranger training kicked in. His mind raced through protocol. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Back away slowly. But his body remained frozen, caught between the instinct to flee and the knowledge that running would be fatal. Easy now, Ethan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Easy, big fella. No need for trouble here. The bear dropped to all fours, its head swaying from side to side as it regarded Ethan. It was close enough that he could see the steam of its breath in the cool air, could smell the musty, wild scent of its fur. Ethan's eyes darted around, looking for an escape route, a weapon, anything that might help him. The axe he'd been using all morning lay just a few feet away on the porch. If he could reach it. But before he could move, the bear let out another growl, deeper and more threatening than before. It took a lumbering step forward, its massive paws leaving imprints in the soft earth. Back off now, Ethan said, trying to keep his voice calm and authoritative despite the fear coursing through him. He slowly raised his arms, making himself look as large as possible. You don't want any part of this, bear. Just turn around and go back to the woods. For a moment it seemed to work. The bear hesitated, its head tilting as if considering Ethan's words. But then something changed. Maybe it was the wind shifting, carrying Ethan's scent more strongly to the bear. Maybe it was just the unpredictable nature of wild animals. Whatever the reason, the grizzly's demeanor suddenly shifted, from curious to aggressive. With a roar that seemed to shake the very air, the bear reared up on its hind legs again. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he saw the bear's paw swing towards him, its claws glinting wickedly in the sunlight. Time slowed to a crawl. Ethan could see every detail with crystal clarity. The individual hairs on the bear's paw, the curve of its yellowed claws, the play of muscles under its fur. He tried to move, to dodge, but his body felt leaden, responding too slowly to his commands. The bear's paw connected with a force that sent Ethan sprawling. White-hot pain exploded through his left arm as the grizzly's claws tore through flesh and bone. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. For a moment, Ethan lay there, stunned. The world seemed to spin around him, the pain in his arm a pulsing, screaming presence that threatened to overwhelm his senses. But years of training and survival instinct kicked in, pushing through the haze of shock and pain. Move, he gasped, to himself. Move, damn it. Ethan scrambled backward, his good arm scrabbling in the dirt for purchase. His injured arm hung uselessly at his side, a ragged mess of torn flesh and exposed bone. Blood soaked his shredded sleeve, dripping onto the ground. The bear dropped back to all fours, shaking its massive head. It seemed almost surprised by its own attack, as if it hadn't quite meant to strike so hard. But the scent of blood in the air was changing things, awakening deeper, more primal instincts in the animal. Ethan's back hit the porch steps, halting his retreat. His mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. The axe was tantalizingly close, just a few feet away on the porch. But to reach it, he'd have to turn his back on the bear, leaving himself completely vulnerable. Okay, Ethan, he muttered to himself, his voice shaky with pain and fear. Think. You've trained for this. What do you do? The bear took another step forward, its nose twitching as it scented the air. Ethan knew he was running out of time. He had to do something, and fast. His good hand found a rock on the ground beside him. Without thinking, he hurled it at the bear. It struck the grizzly's shoulder, bouncing off harmlessly. But it was enough to make the bear pause, shaking its head in confusion. Seizing the moment, Ethan lunged for the porch. Pain lanced through his injured arm as he moved, nearly causing him to black out. But he gritted his teeth and pushed through it, his good hand frantically searching for anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers closed around a thick piece of firewood. It wasn't ideal, but it was all he had. Ethan spun around, brandishing the log like a club. The bear was almost upon him now, its hot breath washing over him in panting gusts. Ethan could see the individual whiskers on its snout, the flecks of gold in its small, dark eyes. Come on then, Ethan shouted, his voice cracking with fear and defiance. You want a piece of me? Come and get it. With all his strength, Ethan hurled the log at the bear. Time seemed to slow as the piece of wood tumbled through the air. For a heart-stopping moment, Ethan thought he'd missed. But then the log struck, the bear squarely on the snout with a solid thunk. The grizzly reared back, roaring in pain and surprise. It shook its massive head, pawing at its nose with a look that was almost comically bewildered. Ethan didn't wait to see what would happen next. Clutching his mangled arm to his chest, he staggered to his feet and made a break for the tree line. His vision swam, dark spots dancing at the edges, but he forced himself to keep moving. "Run!" he gasped to himself. "Just run. Don't look back. Don't stop." Behind him, he could hear the bear's angry roars, the sound of branches snapping as it gave chase. Ethan's lungs burned, his legs felt like lead, but terror gave him speed he didn't know he still possessed. He crashed through the underbrush, heedless of the branches that whipped at his face and tore at his clothes. All that mattered was putting distance between himself and the enraged grizzly at his heels. Ethan's foot caught on a root, sending him sprawling. He hit the ground hard, crying out as the impact jarred his injured arm. For a moment, he lay there, certain that this was the end. He could almost feel the bear's hot breath on the back of his neck, its teeth closing around his skull. But the killing blow didn't come. Ethan rolled over, his good hand groping for a stick, a rock, anything he could use to defend himself. The bear stood a few yards away, its sides heaving as it watched him. There was something almost thoughtful in its gaze, as if it were weighing the effort of continuing the chase against the reward of catching its prey. "Go on," Ethan wheezed, waving his hand weakly. "Get out of here. You've done enough damage for one day." As if understanding his words, the bear snorted once, then turned and lumbered back into the deeper woods. The sound of its passage faded, leaving Ethan alone with the normal sounds of the forest. For a long moment he lay there, hardly daring to believe he was still alive. The pain in his arm, which had receded to a dull throb during the chase, came roaring back with a vengeance. Ethan groaned, fighting against the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. Gotta get back," he muttered, forcing himself to sit up. "Gotta get help." Slowly, painfully, Ethan got to his feet. He swayed, lightheaded from blood loss and shock, but managed to stay upright. Cradling his injured arm, he began the long, arduous journey back to his cabin. As he stumbled through the woods, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide another bear. Every rustle of leaves sounded like approaching danger. But nothing attacked. And gradually, the familiar shape of his cabin came into view through the trees. Ethan practically fell against his front door, fumbling with the handle. As he finally managed to push it open and stagger inside, the full weight of what had just happened hit him. He'd survived a grizzly bear attack, something he'd seen go horribly wrong for others during his years as a ranger. "Lucky," he gasped, sliding down to sit on the floor just inside the door. So damn lucky. But as the adrenaline began to fade and the true extent of his injuries became clear, Ethan knew his ordeal was far from over. He needed medical attention, and fast. With a groan, he forced himself to stand once more, stumbling towards the phone to call for help. As he dialed, Ethan cast one last glance out the window at the peaceful-looking forest. Somewhere out there, the bear was still roaming. And despite his pain and fear, a small part of Ethan couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for the powerful creature that had nearly ended his life. Ethan's fingers trembled as he punched in the numbers on his old landline phone. The pain in his arm had intensified to an unbearable level, and he could feel the warm trickle of blood still seeping from his wounds. 911, what's your emergency?" A calm voice answered after 2 rings. "This is Ethan Morgan," he gasped, his voice raspy and strained. "I'm at 1542 Pine Ridge Road, about 15 miles outside of Big Sky. I've been attacked by a grizzly bear. I need medical assistance immediately." "Sir, stay calm. We're dispatching emergency services to your location now. Can you tell me about your injuries?" Ethan glanced down at his mangled arm, fighting back a wave of nausea. "My left arm. It's bad. Deep lacerations, possible fracture. I'm losing a lot of blood." "Okay, Mr. Morgan, I need you to find something to use as a tourniquet. Can you do that?" "Yeah, I think so," Ethan mumbled, his eyes scanning the room. He spotted a dish towel hanging from the oven handle. "I've got a towel. I can use that." "Good. Wrap it tightly above the wound to slow the bleeding. Help is on the way. Stay on the line with me, okay?" Ethan nodded, forgetting for a moment that the operator couldn't see him. He wedged the phone between his ear and shoulder, using his good hand to grab the towel and wrap it around his upper arm. The pressure sent a jolt of pain through him, but he gritted his teeth and tightened it further. "It's done," he reported, his breath coming in short gasps. "How long until they get here?" "EMS should arrive in about 20 minutes. In the meantime, I need you to stay awake and keep talking to me. Can you tell me more about what happened?" Ethan leaned back against the kitchen counter, sliding down to sit on the floor. He closed his eyes, the events of the past hour replaying in his mind like a vivid nightmare. "I was cutting firewood," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Heard something in the woods, then this massive grizzly just appeared out of nowhere. It was so fast." He trailed off, remembering the terrifying moment when the bear had charged. The operator's voice brought him back to the present. "Mr. Morgan? Are you still there?" "Yeah, sorry," Ethan mumbled. "It's just, I've been a ranger for over 30 years. I've dealt with bears before. But this one, it was different, more aggressive." As he spoke, Ethan's eyes drifted to the window. The forest beyond seemed peaceful now, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, but he knew the bear was still out there somewhere. "The bear, it came at me so quickly," he continued, forcing himself to focus. "I didn't have time to react. It swiped at me with its paw, caught my arm. The pain was indescribable." Ethan paused, taking a shaky breath. The memory of those moments was almost too much to bear. "Mr. Morgan, you're doing great," the operator encouraged. "Just keep talking. What happened next?" "I fell back," Ethan said, his good hand absently touching the makeshift tourniquet. "Scrambled away as fast as I could. My hand found a log on the porch and I threw it. Somehow it hit the bear right on the snout. Despite the pain and fear, a small chuckle escaped Ethan's lips. You should have seen its face. Looked so surprised, like it couldn't believe I'd actually fought back." "That was quick thinking," the operator praised. "What did you do after that?" Ethan's expression darkened. "I ran. Didn't look back, just ran into the woods. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush. Thought for sure it was going to catch me." He paused, remembering the heart-stopping moment when he'd tripped and fallen. But then, it just stopped, like it decided I wasn't worth the trouble anymore. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting for it to finish me off. But it just left. A wave of dizziness washed over Ethan, and he closed his eyes, fighting to stay conscious. The operator's voice seemed to come from far away. "Mr. Morgan, are you still with me?" "Yeah," Ethan mumbled. "Just feeling a bit woozy. That's normal given your blood loss. Stay with me, okay? Help is almost there. Can you hear any sirens yet?" Ethan strained his ears, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart and the rustle of leaves outside. "Not yet," he replied. "They should be there soon," the operator assured him. "In the meantime, can you tell me more about the bear? This information could be important for the wildlife authorities." Ethan nodded, grateful for something to focus on besides the pain. "It was a grizzly, no doubt about that. Bigger than any I've seen before. Dark brown fur, almost looked silver in places. Probably an older male." He paused, remembering the bear's eyes. There was something in its eyes. Not just wildness, but intelligence. Like it was sizing me up. "That's very helpful, Mr. Morgan. Did you notice any distinguishing marks? Scars or unusual coloring?" Ethan frowned, trying to recall details through the haze of pain and adrenaline. "I don't think so. Everything happened so fast. But its left ear, I think it might have been torn, like it had been in fights before." As he spoke, a faint sound caught Ethan's attention. He held his breath, listening intently. "I think I hear sirens," he said, relief flooding through him. "That's great news, Mr. Morgan. They should be there any minute. Is your front door unlocked?" Ethan's heart sank as he realized he couldn't remember if he'd locked the door when he'd stumbled in earlier. I'm not sure," he admitted. "I don't know if I can get up to check." "That's okay. the operator soothed. "Just stay where you are. The EMS team will find a way in." The sound of sirens grew louder, and Ethan could now see flashing lights through his kitchen window. A moment later, he heard car doors slamming and voices calling out, "Mr. Morgan? Ethan Morgan? Are you in there?" "Here," Ethan called out, his voice weaker than he'd expected. "I'm in here." The front door burst open, and two paramedics rushed in, their eyes quickly finding Ethan on the kitchen floor. "We've got him," one of the paramedics said into a radio. To Ethan, he said, "Sir, we're here to help. Can you tell me where you're hurt?" As the paramedics began to assess his injuries, Ethan heard the operator's voice one last time through the phone that had slipped from his grasp. "Mr. Morgan, the emergency team is with you now. You're going to be okay. I'm going to disconnect now. Take care." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. The paramedics carefully cut away Ethan's blood-soaked shirt, revealing the full extent of his injuries. He heard them speaking in urgent professional tones, using medical terms he didn't fully understand. As they worked to stabilize him, a sheriff's deputy appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Morgan," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I know you've been through a lot, but I need to ask you a few questions about the bear attack. Is that okay?" Ethan nodded weakly. "Sure," he managed to say. "Can you describe the bear? And can you show me exactly where the attack took place?" Ethan started to answer, but one of the paramedics interrupted. "I'm sorry, Deputy, but we need to get Mr. Morgan to the hospital immediately. His injuries are severe, and he's lost a lot of blood. You'll have to question him later." The deputy nodded, understanding. "Of course, Mr. Morgan, we'll talk when you're feeling better. For now, just focus on getting well." As the paramedics prepared to move him to the ambulance, Ethan's gaze drifted to the window one last time. The forest outside was growing dark, shadows lengthening between the trees. Somewhere out there, the bear was still roaming free. "Be careful," Ethan murmured to the deputy. "It's still out there, and it's not afraid of humans." The deputy's expression grew serious. "We'll take precautions, sir. Don't worry about that now. Let's get you to the hospital." As they lifted him onto the stretcher, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and unease. He was safe now, or as safe as he could be given his injuries, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with the grizzly wasn't over. Somehow, he knew their paths would cross again. The last thing Ethan saw before they wheeled him out of his cabin was the darkening forest, silent and mysterious, holding its secrets close. The ambulance siren wailed as it sped down the winding mountain road, carrying Ethan away from his cabin and the scene of the bear attack. Inside, paramedics worked feverishly to stabilize him, their voices a blur of medical jargon that barely registered in Ethan's pain-addled mind. "BP's dropping. We need to get this bleeding under control," one paramedic said urgently. "Hang," another unit of saline, the other responded. "Mr. Morgan, can you hear me? Stay with us, okay?" Ethan tried to nod, but even that small movement sent waves of pain through his body. He closed his eyes, memories of the attack flooding back with vivid clarity. The bear's massive form rising before him, its hot breath on his face. The searing pain as its claws tore into his arm. The frantic scramble for safety. "Bear," Ethan mumbled, his eyes snapping open. "The bear. It's still out there." The paramedic leaned over him, her face etched with concern. "It's okay, Mr. Morgan. You're safe now. We're taking you to the hospital." But Ethan couldn't shake the image of the grizzly, its intelligent eyes watching him as he fled. He tried to sit up, ignoring the stabbing pain in his arm. "No, you don't understand," he gasped. "It's not a normal bear. It's different. Dangerous. People need to know." The paramedic gently but firmly pushed him back down. "Sir, please try to remain still. You've lost a lot of blood. The wildlife authorities have been notified. They'll handle the situation." Ethan wanted to argue, to make them understand the unique threat this bear posed, but exhaustion was overtaking him. The adrenaline that had kept him going was fading, leaving him weak and disoriented. As the ambulance rounded a sharp curve, Ethan's gaze drifted to the small window. The forest rushed by, a blur of dark shapes against the dimming sky. Somewhere in those woods, the bear was still out there. His mind wandered back to the moment of his escape. The log had struck the bear's snout, giving Ethan a precious few seconds to flee. He remembered the burning in his lungs as he ran, the sound of the bear crashing through the underbrush behind him. In his mind's eye, Ethan saw himself stumbling through the forest, branches whipping at his face, roots threatening to trip him with every step. The bear's heavy footfalls had seemed to shake the very ground, drawing closer with each passing second. I can't outrun it, Ethan had thought desperately. I need to find cover. His ranger training had kicked in, years of experience guiding. His actions, even as panic threatened to overwhelm him. He'd spotted a fallen tree ahead, its massive trunk creating a natural barrier. With the last of his strength, Ethan had hurled himself behind the tree, pressing his back against the rough bark. He'd held his breath, listening intently for any sign of the bear's approach. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No birds calling, no small animals scurrying about, just the sound of Ethan's ragged breathing and the dull throb of pain from his mangled arm. Then he'd heard it, the bear's heavy breathing, so close he could almost feel it on the back of his neck. Ethan had squeezed his eyes shut, certain that at any moment the grizzly would round the tree and finish what it had started. But instead he'd heard a snuffling sound followed by a low growl. Opening his eyes, Ethan had seen the bear's massive paw reach around the tree trunk, razor-sharp claws gouging the bark mere inches from his face. In that moment, pure instinct had taken over. Ethan had lashed out with his good arm, his boot connecting solidly with the bear's sensitive nose. The bear had roared in pain and surprise, rearing back. Ethan had seized the opportunity, scrambling to his feet and running blindly through the forest. He hadn't dared look back, certain that at any moment he'd feel the bear's claws tearing into him again. But somehow, miraculously, he'd made it. The sound of the bear's pursuit had faded, and Ethan had found himself stumbling out of the tree line, his cabin a welcome sight in the clearing ahead. Now, as the ambulance sped towards the hospital, Ethan tried to make sense of what had happened. Why had the bear attacked so aggressively? And why had it suddenly given up the chase? "Mr. Morgan?" The paramedic's voice brought him back to the present. "We're almost at the hospital. How are you feeling?" Ethan blinked, realizing he'd been lost in his thoughts. I'm okay," he mumbled. "Just tired. And my arm. I know it hurts," the paramedic said sympathetically. "We've given you something for the pain, but we need to keep you awake for now. Can you tell me more about what happened after you got away from the bear?" Ethan nodded weakly. "I made it back to my cabin, somehow. Everything was a blur. I remember fumbling with the door, practically falling inside. The pain, it was overwhelming." He paused, remembering the moment he'd slammed the cabin door shut behind him. The sense of relief had been short-lived as the full impact of what had happened hit him. "I collapsed against the door," Ethan continued. "I could see out the window, kept expecting to see the bear appear at any moment, but it didn't come." The paramedic nodded encouragingly. "That must have been terrifying. What did you do next?" "I knew I needed help," Ethan said. "I dragged myself to the phone, called 911. Everything after that is hazy." The ambulance began to slow, and Ethan could hear the bustle of activity outside. They must be arriving at the hospital. As the back doors of the ambulance swung open, Ethan caught one last glimpse of the darkening sky. The mountains loomed in the distance, the forests a vast shadowy expanse. Somewhere out there, the bear was still roaming free. A team of doctors and nurses swarmed around the ambulance, their voices urgent but controlled. As they wheeled Ethan into the emergency room, he tried to focus on their faces, on the bright lights overhead. Anything to keep his mind off the lingering fear that seemed to have taken root in his chest. "Male, 62 years old, severe lacerations and possible fractures to the left arm from a grizzly bear attack," one of the paramedics reported to the waiting medical team. "He's lost a significant amount of blood and may be going into shock." The next few minutes were a whirlwind of activity. Ethan felt himself being transferred to a hospital bed, heard the snip of scissors as they cut away what remained of his clothes. Voices called out orders, machines beeped, and through it all, the pain in his arm throbbed relentlessly. A doctor leaned over him, her face serious but kind. "Mr. Morgan, I'm Dr. Patel. We're going to take good care of you, okay? Can you tell me how much pain you're in, on a scale of 1 to 10? Ethan tried to focus on her face on the question at hand. 8, he managed to say. Maybe 9, Dr. Patel nodded. We're going to give you something stronger for the pain now. You might start to feel a bit drowsy, but that's normal. We need to take you into surgery to repair the damage to your arm. Do you understand? Ethan nodded weakly. As the pain medication began to take effect, he felt himself drifting. The bright lights of the emergency room seemed to dim, the voices around him becoming muffled and distant. Just before, consciousness slipped away entirely. Ethan's mind returned once more to the forest, to the bear that had nearly ended his life. In his last moments of awareness, he could have sworn he heard a distant roar, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hospital. But then the darkness closed in, and Ethan Morgan knew no more. The steady beep of a heart monitor gradually pierced through the fog of Ethan's consciousness. His eyelids felt heavy as he struggled to open them, the sterile white of a hospital room slowly coming into focus. The pain in his left arm had dulled to a persistent ache, and he could feel the tight wrap of bandages around it. As his senses sharpened, Ethan became aware of a presence in the room. He turned his head slightly, wincing at the stiffness in his neck, to see a nurse checking his IV. "Mr. Morgan," the nurse said softly, noticing he was awake. "How are you? Feeling?" Ethan tried to speak, but his throat was dry and raw. The nurse quickly offered him a small cup of water with a straw. After a few sips, Ethan managed to croak out, "Like I got hit by a truck. Or a bear." The nurse smiled sympathetically. "That's to be expected. You've been through quite an ordeal. Do you remember what happened?" Memories flooded back, the bear's roar, the searing pain as claws tore into his flesh, the desperate flight through the forest. Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah, I remember. How long have I been here?" "You've been in and out for about 24 hours, the nurse explained. "The doctor will be in soon to check on you and explain your injuries. Is there anyone you'd like us to call for you?" Ethan shook his head. His wife had passed away years ago and they'd never had children. The solitary life of a forest ranger didn't lend itself to many close friendships. "No, there's no one. Thanks." As the nurse made a note in his chart, Ethan's gaze drifted to the window. The hospital was in Big Sky, and he could see the mountains in the distance, shrouded in early morning mist. Somewhere out there, the bear that had attacked him was still roaming free. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Patel entered, her face breaking into a smile when she saw Ethan was awake. "Mr. Morgan, it's good to see you alert. How are you feeling?" Ethan shifted in the bed, wincing as the movement jostled his injured arm. "I've been better, Doc. But I guess I should be thankful I'm alive." Dr. Patel nodded, her expression turning serious. "Indeed. You're very lucky, Mr. Morgan. The bear's attack caused significant damage to your left arm. There were deep lacerations, and your humerus, the upper arm bone, was fractured." She paused, allowing Ethan to process the information before continuing. "We performed surgery to repair the bone and close the wounds. You'll need physical therapy, but with time and work, we expect you to regain most of the function in your arm." Ethan absorbed this news, his right hand unconsciously moving to touch the thick bandages on his left arm. "Thank you, doctor. When can I go home?" Dr. Patel's brow furrowed slightly. "We'd like to keep you for at least another day for observation. And even after you're discharged, you'll need to stay in town for a while for follow-up appointments and to start your physical therapy." Ethan started to protest, but Dr. Patel held up a hand. "I understand you probably want to get back to your cabin, Mr. Morgan, but your recovery needs to be our priority right now. Besides," she added, her tone softening, "I believe the wildlife authorities want to speak with you about the attack." As if on cue, there was another knock at the door. A man in a ranger's uniform entered, his face lighting up with recognition when he saw Ethan. "Ethan Morgan, as I live and breathe," the man said, stepping forward. "When I heard about the attack, I couldn't believe it was you." Ethan squinted at the man, memory slowly surfacing. Mike Dawson?" Mike nodded, grinning. "The one and only. It's been, 5 years since you retired. Never thought I'd see you in a hospital bed. You were always the one giving the safety lectures." Despite the pain and the gravity of the situation, Ethan found himself chuckling. "Yeah, well, even old rangers can have bad days." What brings you here, Mike? Mike's expression turned serious. I'm here about the bear, Ethan. We need to know exactly what happened. This kind of aggressive behavior isn't typical even for a grizzly. Dr. Patel interjected. Mr. Morgan needs his rest. Perhaps this could wait? But Ethan shook his head. No, it's all right, Doc. This is important. He turned back to Mike. What do you need to know? For the next hour, Ethan recounted every detail of the attack he could remember. Mike listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification or more details about the bear's behavior. And you're sure it was unprovoked? Mike asked. You didn't surprise it or get between it and a food source? Ethan shook his head emphatically. No, Mike, I've dealt with bears for decades. I know how to avoid provoking them. This was different. It's like it came looking for a fight. Mike frowned, jotting notes in a small pad. That's concerning. Ethan, we've had reports of increased bear activity in the area, but nothing like this. We'll need to step up patrols, maybe even consider relocating the bear if we can find it. As Mike continued to speak about potential courses of action, Ethan's mind wandered back to the moment of the attack. He could still see the bear's eyes, intelligent and somehow calculating. It wasn't like any bear encounter he'd ever had before. Ethan, you still with us? Mike's voice brought him back to the present. Yeah, sorry, Ethan mumbled. Just remembering. Mike nodded sympathetically. I know it must have been terrifying, but your experience could help prevent future attacks. We'll need you to file a formal report once you're feeling up to it. As Mike prepared to leave, Ethan suddenly remembered something. Mike, wait. There's something else you should know. Mike paused at the door, turning back. What is it? Ethan hesitated, wondering if he'd sound crazy. But he knew it was important. The bear. It didn't just attack and leave. It chased me. And when I hid, it was like it was hunting me. Deliberately. Mike's eyebrows rose. That's unusual. Are you sure? Ethan nodded firmly. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Mike. This wasn't a normal bear encounter. It was something else. Mike was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he nodded. All right, Ethan, I'll make sure that's in the report. We'll take it seriously, I promise. After Mike left, Ethan sank back into his pillows, suddenly exhausted. Dr. Patel, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward. You should rest now, Mr. Morgan. Your body needs time to heal. Ethan nodded, his eyelids already growing heavy. But as he drifted off to sleep, his mind was filled with images of the bear, its powerful form moving through the forest, eyes gleaming, with an almost human intelligence. In his dreams, Ethan found himself back in the woods, the bear always just out of sight but undeniably present. He could hear its breathing, smell its musky scent. And somehow he knew it was waiting for him, biding its time until their paths would cross again. When Ethan woke hours later, the room was dark, save for the soft glow of medical equipment. He blinked, disoriented for a moment, before the pain in his arm reminded him where he was and why. Gingerly, he reached for the cup of water on his bedside table. As he sipped, his eyes were drawn to the window. The moon hung low over the mountains, casting a silvery light over the landscape. The forest was a dark, mysterious expanse stretching to the horizon. Ethan shivered, though the room was warm. He couldn't shake the feeling that out there, under the cover of darkness, the bear was on the move, and somehow, deep in his bones, he knew their encounter wasn't over. With a sigh, Ethan settled back into bed, trying to push the thoughts away. He needed to focus on healing, on getting strong again. Because next time, and he was certain there would be a next time, he'd be ready. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room flickered to life, startling Ethan from a fitful sleep. He blinked rapidly, his eyes adjusting to the sudden brightness. A nurse entered, her soft-soled shoes barely making a sound on the linoleum floor. Good morning, Mr. Morgan, she said cheerfully. How are you feeling today? Ethan grunted, shifting in the bed. The movement sent a jolt of pain through his injured arm. Been better, he muttered. The nurse nodded sympathetically as she checked his vitals. Dr. Patel will be in soon to discuss your progress. Is there anything you need in the meantime? Ethan shook his head, his eyes drifting to the window. The sun was just beginning to peek over the mountains, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. It was the kind of morning he would have enjoyed from his cabin porch, coffee in hand. Instead, he was trapped in this sterile room, the scent of antiseptic replacing the crisp mountain air he loved. As the nurse left, Ethan's thoughts wandered back to the attack. The memory of the bear's hot breath, the glint of its claws, the searing pain as they tore into his flesh. It all felt so vivid, as if it had happened only moments ago rather than days. A knock at the door interrupted his dark reverie. Dr. Patel entered, her face serious as she studied the chart in her hands. "Mr. Morgan," she began, looking up at him. "We need to discuss your injuries and the road to recovery ahead." Ethan steeled himself, knowing this conversation wouldn't be easy. "Give it to me straight, Doc. How bad is it?" Dr. Patel pulled up a chair, sitting down beside the bed. Her expression was grave but not unkind. "The damage to your arm was extensive, Mr. Morgan. The bear's claws caused deep lacerations, severing several tendons and muscles. Additionally, your humerus, the upper arm bone, sustained a compound fracture." She paused, allowing Ethan to absorb this information before continuing. "We've managed to repair much of the damage surgically, but you're looking at a long recovery period. You'll need extensive physical therapy to regain function in your arm, and even then, you may not regain full strength or range of motion." Ethan felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. He'd known it was bad, but hearing the full extent of his injuries made it painfully real. "What are we talking about here, Doc? Months? Years?" Dr. Patel's expression softened. "It's hard to give an exact timeline, Mr. Morgan. Everyone heals differently. But you're looking at several months of intensive therapy at minimum. And it could be a year or more before you're back to anything close to your previous level of function, if you get there at all." Ethan let out a long, slow breath, his good hand clenching the bedsheet. "And if I don't do the therapy? If I just let it heal on its own?" Dr. Patel's brow furrowed. "I wouldn't recommend that, Mr. Morgan. Without proper rehabilitation, you could lose significant function in your arm. In the worst-case scenario, it could become essentially useless." The weight of her words settled over Ethan like a heavy blanket. He'd spent his entire adult life in the wilderness, relying on his physical strength and capabilities. The thought of losing that, of becoming disabled, was almost too much to bear. "I understand this is a lot to take in," Dr. Patel said gently. "We have excellent physical therapists here who can work with you, and there are support groups for survivors of animal attacks that you might find helpful." Ethan nodded absently, his mind still reeling from the news. "Thanks, Doc. I need some time to process all this." Dr. Patel stood, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Of course. Take all the time you need. We'll be here when you're ready to discuss next steps." As she left the room, Ethan turned his gaze back to the window. The mountains loomed. In the distance, a reminder of the life he'd built in the wilderness he loved. Now it all seemed so far away, separated by more than just miles. The day passed in a blur of medical checks, pain medication, and fitful naps. As evening approached, Ethan found himself drifting in and out of consciousness, his dreams plagued by nightmares of gleaming claws and razor-sharp teeth. In one particularly vivid dream, he was back in the forest running from the bear. But this time, his injured arm hung uselessly at his side, slowing him down. He could hear the bear's heavy breathing behind him, getting closer with each passing second. Just as he felt its hot breath on the back of his neck, Ethan jolted awake, his heart pounding. A gentle hand on his shoulder made him flinch. "Easy there, Mr. Morgan, you're safe, it was just a dream." Ethan blinked, his eyes focusing on the concerned face of a night nurse. "Sorry," he mumbled, embarrassed. "Guess I got a little caught up in it." The nurse smiled sympathetically. "It's perfectly normal after what you've been through. Would you like something to help you sleep?" Ethan shook his head. "No, thanks. I think I've slept enough for now." As the nurse left, Ethan's gaze drifted to his injured arm. Even in the dim light of the room, he could see the bulky bandages, the tubes running from various machines. His arm throbbed beneath the cast, a constant reminder of how close he had come to death. A movement at the door caught his attention. A man in a khaki uniform entered, his face lined with concern and something that looked like guilt. "Ethan, you up for a visitor?" Ethan squinted in the low light. "Mike, what are you doing here so late?" Mike Dawson, his former colleague from the Forest Service, stepped further into the room. "Just got off shift. Thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing." He paused, taking in Ethan's haggard appearance. "Rough day, huh?" Ethan let out a humorless chuckle. "You could say that." Doc laid out the full extent of the damage. "It's not great." Mike pulled up a chair, his expression somber. "I'm sorry, Ethan. This never should have happened. We've been tracking this. Bear for weeks had reports of it acting strangely aggressive. We should have done more." Ethan shook his head. "It's not your fault, Mike. Bears are wild animals. Sometimes these things just happen." But even as he said it, Ethan knew it wasn't entirely true. The bear that had attacked him wasn't just any wild animal. There had been something different about it, something almost deliberate in its actions. Mike leaned forward, his voice low. "Listen, Ethan, I need to ask you some more questions about the attack. Some of the details you mentioned earlier, they don't quite add up with typical bear behavior." Ethan tensed, sensing where this was going. "What do you mean?" "The way you described the bear hunting you, its persistence. It's not normal, Ethan. We've had other reports of this bear, displaying unusually aggressive behavior. I need to know everything you can remember, no matter how strange it might seem." For a long moment, Ethan was silent, weighing his words carefully. Finally, he spoke. "It wasn't like any bear I've ever encountered, Mike. The way it looked at me, it was like it knew exactly what it was doing. Like it was smart, you know? Not just acting on instinct." Mike's pen scratched rapidly across his notepad. "Anything else? Any distinguishing marks or behaviors?" Ethan closed his eyes, trying to recall every detail of that terrifying encounter. "Its left ear, I think it was torn, and its eyes, they were almost yellow, intelligent, like it could see right through me." As he spoke, the memory of the attack seemed to come alive again. Ethan could almost smell the bear's musky odor, feel its hot breath on his face. His heart rate spiked, the monitor beside his bed beeping frantically. Mike stood quickly, concern etched on his face. "That's enough for now, Ethan. You need to rest." As if on cue, a nurse hurried into the room, alerted by the change in Ethan's vitals. "Mr. Morgan, are you all right?" Ethan nodded, trying to slow his breathing. "Yeah, sorry. Just remembering." The nurse gave Mike a pointed look. "I think that's enough excitement for one night. Mr. Morgan needs his rest." Mike nodded, gathering his things. "Of course, thanks, Ethan. We'll talk more when you're feeling better." As Mike left and the nurse fussed over him, adjusting his medication and checking his bandages, Ethan's mind was far away. He was back in the forest, face to face with the bear that had nearly ended his life. And somehow, he knew with a bone-deep certainty that their paths would cross again. The nurse's voice brought him back to the present. "There you go, Mr. Morgan. Try to get some sleep now." But as Ethan closed his eyes, he knew sleep would be a long time coming. The bear's intelligent, almost human gaze seemed burned into his retinas, a constant reminder of the danger that still lurked in the wilderness he'd once called home. The familiar scent of pine greeted Ethan as he stepped out of the ranger's truck, his good arm clutching a small duffel bag. After 2 weeks in the hospital and another week in a rehabilitation facility in Big Sky, he was finally back at his cabin. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clearing, and a cool breeze rustled through the trees. Mike Dawson, who had insisted on driving Ethan home, came around the truck with a concerned look on his face. "You sure you're going to be okay out here on your own, Ethan? It's not too late to take up my offer. Sarah and I have plenty of room at our place in town." Ethan shook his head, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Thanks, Mike, but I'll be fine. This is my home. I need to be here." Mike nodded reluctantly. "All right, but promise me you'll call if you need anything. And remember, you've got that follow-up with Dr. Patel next week. I'll swing by to drive you in." "I appreciate it," Ethan said, his voice gruff with emotion. He wasn't used to relying on others, and the past few weeks had been a struggle in more ways than one. As Mike helped him carry his things inside, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. His eyes darted nervously around the clearing, half expecting to see the bear lurking nearby. The rational part of his mind knew it was unlikely, The Wildlife Service had been patrolling the area heavily since the attack. But the fear remained, a constant presence in the back of his mind. Once inside, Ethan surveyed his cabin. Everything was exactly as he'd left it on that fateful day, yet it all seemed somehow different. The cozy space that had once been his sanctuary now felt exposed. Vulnerable. Mike set down the last of Ethan's bags and turned to him. "You sure you don't want me to stay for a while? I could bunk on the couch, keep you company." Ethan forced a smile. "I'm sure, Mike, I need to get used to being on my own again, but thanks for everything." After a few more reassurances and promises to call if he needed anything, Ethan finally saw Mike off. As the sound of the truck's engine faded into the distance, the silence of the forest settled around him like a heavy blanket. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped out onto his porch. The woodpile where he had been attacked stood untouched, mocking him with its ordinary appearance. Logs lay scattered where he'd dropped them in his desperate flight from the bear. Stealing himself, Ethan forced his feet to move. He walked slowly across the clearing to the spot where it had happened. Each step felt like a monumental effort, his heart racing as the memories flooded back. He could almost see it all happening again. The bear rising up on its hind legs, its massive paw swinging towards him. Ethan's left arm throbbed in its sling, a phantom pain that seemed to echo the moment of impact. A rustling in the bushes made him jump, his good hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. A squirrel darted out, chattering angrily at him before scampering up a nearby tree. Ethan let out a shaky laugh, realizing how on edge he was. "Get a grip, old man," he muttered to himself. "It's just the woods. Your woods." But even as he said it, Ethan knew things had changed. The forest that had once been his home, his place of peace and solitude, now felt alien and threatening. Every shadow seemed to hide potential danger, every sound a possible threat. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the clearing, Ethan's eyes caught on something. There, caught on a low-hanging branch, was a single tuft of brown fur. His breath caught in his throat as he reached out with trembling fingers to touch it. The fur was coarse and thick, unmistakably that of a grizzly bear. Ethan's mind raced. Was this from the bear that had attacked him? Had it returned to the scene in his absence? For a long moment, Ethan stood frozen, the tuft of fur between his fingers. It was the only tangible proof that the attack hadn't been some terrible nightmare. In that moment, the reality of what had happened, and how close he had come to death, hit him with full force. His legs gave way and Ethan sank to the ground, his back against a tree. Tears he had been holding back for weeks finally came, a release of fear, pain, and pent-up emotion. He wept for the life he had known, for the sense of safety he had lost, for the long and uncertain road to recovery that lay ahead. As the sobs subsided, Ethan became aware of the deepening twilight around him. The forest was coming alive with night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Sounds that had once been comforting now sent shivers down his spine. Slowly, painfully, he pulled himself to his feet. The tuft of fur was still clutched in his hand. Part of him wanted to throw it away, to pretend he had never found it. But instead, he carefully tucked it into his pocket, a reminder perhaps, or a warning. Back inside his cabin, Ethan went through the motions of his evening routine. He heated up a can of soup, not having the energy or inclination to cook anything more substantial. As he ate, his eyes kept drifting to the windows, searching the darkness beyond for any sign of movement. After dinner, he found himself double-checking the locks on the doors and windows, something he had rarely bothered with before. The cabin that had once felt like a seamless part of the surrounding wilderness now seemed like a fragile fortress against the dangers lurking outside. As he prepared for bed, Ethan caught sight of himself in the bathroom mirror. The man looking back at him seemed older, more haggard than he remembered. The sling supporting his injured arm was a stark reminder of how much had changed. Gingerly, he removed the sling and began the painful process of changing his bandages. The scars were still angry and red, a roadmap of the bear's attack etched into his flesh. Dr. Patel had warned him that they would likely never fade completely, a permanent reminder of his brush with death. That night, sleep eluded Ethan. He tossed and turned, his injured arm aching, his mind unable to quiet. Every creak of the cabin's timbers, every rustle of wind through the trees outside, had him on high alert. In the early hours of the morning, he gave up on sleep altogether. He made his way to the living room, settling into his favorite armchair by the window. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, Ethan watched the forest come alive. A deer emerged from the trees, moving cautiously into the clearing. It paused, its ears twitching, before lowering its head to graze. The sight was so normal, so beautifully ordinary, that Ethan felt something in his chest loosen slightly. Yes, the bear was still out there somewhere. Yes, the wilderness held dangers he was now acutely aware of, but it was also still the place he loved. The home he had chosen all those years ago. As the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ethan made a decision. He wouldn't let fear drive him away from the life he had built. It wouldn't be easy, and the road to recovery, both physical and mental, would be long, but he would face it one day at a time. The bear might have taken his sense of safety, might have left him scarred and changed, but it hadn't taken his spirit, his love for this wild place. And that, Ethan realized as he watched the new day, dawn, was something worth fighting for. Weeks passed, and the Montana wilderness transformed as autumn gave way to the first whispers of winter. The vibrant reds and golds of fall foliage faded to brown, and a crisp chill permeated the air. For Ethan Morgan, the changing seasons marked the slow, often frustrating journey of recovery. Each morning, Ethan woke to the dull ache in his left arm, a constant reminder of his encounter with the grizzly. He'd sit on the edge of his bed, gingerly flexing his fingers and rotating his wrist, grimacing at the stiffness and limited range of motion. The physical therapy exercises Dr. Patel had prescribed were a daily battle, a fight to regain what the bear had taken from him. "Come on, you stubborn old fool," Ethan muttered to himself one morning, gritting his teeth as he attempted to lift a small weight with his injured arm. The trembling in his muscles betrayed how much strength he'd lost. "You've been through worse than this." But even as he said it, Ethan knew it wasn't entirely true. The bear attack had shaken him to his core, leaving scars that went far deeper than the angry red lines on his arm. As he went about his morning routine, Ethan found himself jumping at every rustle in the bushes, every shadow that moved in the corner of his eye. The forest he'd once navigated with confident ease now felt like a labyrinth of potential threats. He'd taken to carrying a can of bear spray whenever he ventured outside, the weight of it in his pocket a small comfort against the fears that plagued him. Later that day, as Ethan sat on his porch, a familiar truck rumbled up the dirt road, leading to his cabin. Mike Dawson stepped out, a folded newspaper tucked under his arm. "Morning, Ethan?" Mike called out, making his way up the porch steps. "Thought I'd stop by, see how you're doing." Ethan nodded in greeting, gesturing for Mike to take a seat. "Appreciate it, Mike. Coffee?" "Wouldn't say no," Mike replied, settling into the chair next to Ethan. As Ethan went inside to fetch the coffee, Mike unfolded the newspaper he'd brought. When Ethan returned with 2 steaming mugs, Mike held up the paper, pointing to a small article on the 3rd page. "Saw this and thought you might want to know," Mike said. "They ran a story about your attack." Ethan took the paper, his eyes scanning the brief article. "Local man survives grizzly attack," the headline read. The piece was short, barely 100 words, outlining the basic facts of the incident and noting that wildlife authorities were monitoring bear activity in the area. "Huh," Ethan grunted, handing the paper back to Mike. "Guess that's my 15 minutes of fame." Mike studied his friend's face, concern evident in his eyes. "How are you really doing, Ethan? And don't give me any of that 'I'm fine' bullshit." Ethan sighed, his gaze drifting to the tree line. It's not easy, Mike. The arm's coming along, but it's slow going. And the rest?" He trailed off, struggling to find the words. "The rest?" Mike prompted gently. "I keep seeing it," Ethan admitted, his voice low. "Every time I close my eyes, every time I hear a noise in the woods, it's like the bear's still out there watching, waiting." Mike nodded solemnly. "That's normal, you know. After what you went through, it'd be strange if you weren't jumpy." "I know that here," Ethan said, tapping his temple. But try telling that to my gut when I wake up in a cold sweat at 3 a.m., convinced I hear something outside my window. They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping their coffee and watching the wind rustle through the trees. Finally, Mike spoke again. You know, there's a support group in town for survivors of animal attacks. Might be worth checking out. Ethan snorted. What? Sit in a circle and talk about my feelings. Not really my style, Mike. Just think about it, Mike urged. Talking to people who've been through similar experiences. It could help. As Mike prepared to leave, he paused at the top of the porch steps. Oh, almost forgot, we got the lab results back on that tuft of fur you found. Ethan tensed, suddenly alert. And? It's definitely from a grizzly, Mike confirmed. But here's the thing, the DNA doesn't match any bear we have on record. In this area. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. What does that mean? Mike shrugged. Could be a lot of things. Maybe a bear that's moved into the territory from somewhere else. Or, he hesitated. Or what? Ethan pressed. Or it could be we're dealing with a bear we haven't encountered before. One that's managed to stay under the radar until now. As Mike's truck disappeared down the road, Ethan remained on the porch, lost in thought. The idea that the bear that had attacked him was still out there, unidentified and untracked, sent a fresh wave of unease through him. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, sleep proving elusive once again, he found himself tracing the jagged scars on his arm. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, they stood out starkly against his skin, a permanent, tangible reminder of his brush with death. He thought about the small article in the newspaper, how quickly life in Big Sky had moved on. To the rest of the world, his attack was just another brief story, soon forgotten. But for Ethan, it had become the defining moment of his life, a clear line dividing before and after. As the night wore on, Ethan's thoughts drifted to the support group Mike had mentioned. His initial reaction had been dismissive, but now, in the quiet darkness of his cabin, he found himself reconsidering, maybe talking to others who understood, who had faced their own moments of terror in the wilderness. Wouldn't be such a bad thing. Just as he was about to drift off, a sound from outside snapped Ethan fully awake. He lay perfectly still, ears straining. There it was again. A soft rustling, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Heart pounding, Ethan slowly got out of bed and made his way to the window. The full moon illuminated the clearing, casting everything in a silvery glow. His eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. For a long moment, all was still. Then, at the edge of the clearing, something moved. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as a massive shape emerged from the shadows. The grizzly bear lumbered into view, its fur gleaming silver in the moonlight. Ethan stood frozen, barely daring to breathe. The bear paused, lifting its head to scent the air. For a heart-stopping moment, Ethan was sure it would turn towards the cabin, that gleaming yellow eyes would meet his through the window glass. But the bear simply continued on its way, moving with surprising grace for such a large creature. It crossed the clearing and disappeared back into the forest on the other side, swallowed up by the darkness beneath the trees. Long after the bear had gone, Ethan remained at the window, his heart rate slowly returning to normal. The encounter, brief as it was, had shaken him. But as the adrenaline faded, he realized something else. He had faced his fear. He had seen the bear, the embodiment of his nightmares, and he had stood his ground. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, Ethan made a decision. He would call Mike later, ask about that support group. He would continue his physical therapy with renewed determination, and he would reclaim his life, his home, from the shadow of fear that had been hanging over him. The bear was still out there, yes. The wilderness still held dangers, but it was also still beautiful, still the place he loved. And Ethan Morgan, battered but unbroken, was still here too, ready to face whatever came next, one day at a time.